All right, so we've completed the first item on our to-do list. We created our student.java class. Now we're going to focus on creating our database utility class. So again, moving back into Eclipse, the first thing I want to do is create the shell or structure here for this class. So I'll simply do a right click and I'll say new class. And the name for this class, I'll call it student.dbutil. And I'll keep all the other defaults here on this screen, and I'll click on the finish button. Okay, great. So a very basic shell of a class right now, student.dbutil. And this is where we need to write some cool code here. So the first thing we want to do is set up a reference to a data source. So I'll just simply say private data source, and I'll fix the imports here, javax.sql. All right, so that's good. Now we need to set up a constructor for this class. So here I'll say student.dbutil. Remember, the constructor has the same name as the class. I'll say student.dbutil, pass in the data source, and I simply assign it. So here I'll say data source equals the data source. So the data source is the parameter being passed into this constructor. And that's basically it. So we're going to have somebody that'll create this student.dbutil, and they'll pass in a reference to our data source object. And actually our servlet will kind of do this work, but we'll see that in a following video. All right. Now the main thing in this student.dbutil is that we're going to have a method that's actually going to list the students. So let me just kind of write the shell here, or the outline here for the method. So we're going to have a method called getStudents and throws exception, possibly. And here we have a return type of list students. So we're going to get a list of students from the database, and then we'll return that. So that's the main method that we're going to create here in this database utility. So let me go ahead and fix the imports here. So java.util.list. And let me just kind of stub out some basic code here to get things lined up. So I'll create this array list students. Right now it's empty, and then I'll say return students. So right now I'm just kind of stubbing things out. In the middle on line 18, we're going to write a lot of code that'll actually populate that array list. But for now, I'm just kind of stubbing it out just so we can kind of see the big picture here for this method. All right, so this method is going to do some database work using Jdbc. So I'll just set up some Jdbc objects right now, set them to null, and then we'll make use of them a little later here in this method. So I'll set up my con, my statement, and also set up my result set. And we'll set all these values to null for right now. And then also I'll use my Eclipse trick again to fix the imports here. So remember, you can go to the source menu and you can say source organize imports. And this will basically help you import the appropriate classes and interfaces and so on. So here I'll choose java.sql.statement, click next. And I'll do a similar thing here for java.sql.connection. And then it'll resolve the result set automatically. And so that takes care of those errors. So that looks really good so far. All right. So now let's kind of roll our sleeves up and let's get down here. So again, I always like to drop in some comments here just to kind of give myself a clue as far as what I need to do before I actually start writing some real code. So here I want to get a connection first. I want to create a SQL statement. Then I want to execute the query, and then process the result set. So kind of a similar thing what we did in the test servlet, but here we're kind of just doing it in a more formal fashion here. And then also closing the Jdbc objects. So that's kind of the big picture, the main outline for this method that we're going to write. All right, and a lot of this code I'll place inside of a try block. And I'll make use of a finally to kind of help me clean up some of the Jdbc objects, but we'll flesh that out in a bit. So let me kind of tab this in. And let's see, that return students, I actually want to move that up a bit. So let me just grab that line 42 and cut it and paste it and put it right here near the end of that try block. All right. Okay. That looks good. Okay. So now we can start cutting some code here. So let's get busy. So the first thing here is getting a connection. So here I'll say mycon equals data source dot get connection. That'll basically give me a connection to the database, and actually give me a connection from that connection pool. Remember, data source is our connection pool. Create a SQL statement here, select star from students, and I'm going to order by last name. So when I get the data from the database, I want it to be ordered by or sorted by the student's last name. And then I simply create a SQL statement object here. So say my statement equals mycon.create statement. All right, so that's the basic process here. Now let's go ahead and execute our query. So I'll have my result set equals my statement.execute query, and then I pass in that SQL string that I just created a little earlier. So this will give me a result set. Now kind of for the heavy lifting here, processing a result set. So we need to go through the loop and perform some operations and build up our list. All right, so here I'll say while myrs.next, basically looping through this result set, then I'll perform some operations. And again, since we have a lot of work to do inside of this while loop, I'll kind of write some comments here just to kind of keep us on track. So the first thing we need to do is retrieve data from the result set row. Based on that information, we're going to create a new student object, and then we're going to add it to our list of students. All right, so that's the basic idea or outline here for this while loop. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and grab the student ID from the result set. So I'll say myrs.getInt ID, and so ID in quotes is the actual column name. I'll also grab the first name. So I'll say myrs.getString, first underscore name. And again, that's the actual column name from the database. And then I will just repeat the process here for last name and also for email address. Okay, great. So now that I have the data off of the row, now I can use that to create a new student object. So I'll make use of my student constructor that I created earlier, and I'll say temp student equals new student, and I pass in the ID, first name, last name, and email address. So that'll create a new student object based on that one row from the result set. And then I simply want to add it to my list of students. So I'll say students.add, and I'll give that temp student. So basically what we'll do in this loop is we'll just keep processing the result set and adding those to our list. Now you may wonder, well, where is students, that list of students? Where'd that come from? Well, just scrolling up to the top of this method here, when we first started out, we created this array list of students. And right now it's empty when we first start out. And then as we go through this for loop or this while loop here, we're going to populate it and keep adding more students to that list. So here's the while loop. We basically retrieve data from the result set row, we create the student object, and we add it to the list of students. And we just keep doing that for each element there in our result set. Now, in a previous video, when we did our little test servlet, I told you it was kind of quick and dirty. But here I actually want to close some of our Jdbc objects. So here, make use of best practices, kind of clean up after ourselves. So whenever we make use of Jdbc objects, we need to close them, like closing the result set, the statement, and also the connection. We don't want to just hold on to them forever, because we'll eventually have a memory leak and we'll run out of statements, cursors, or run out of connections. So here I'm going to call a method here, close, mycon, myStatement, and myrs. Now Eclipse says, hey, buddy, you have a problem here. There's no method in this class called close. So then I'll say, all right, Eclipse, well, why don't you create it for me? Get to work. So this is cool. So if there's a method that's not defined, you can tell Eclipse to create that method, and they'll basically stub it out for you automatically, which is kind of cool. And then inside of this method, I can go ahead and do my real work. All right, so Eclipse created the shell of this method, or the stub of this method, and I'll go ahead and write some code here. So I'll just set up a little try-catch block. And what I want to do inside of this try block is I basically want to close each one of those elements there, or objects. So I'm going to close the result set, statement, and mycon. So the first thing I do is I check to make sure that those objects are not null. So if the myrs is not null, then I'll say myrs.close. All right, so that'll close the result set. And then I'll do a similar thing here for statement. So if my statement is not equal to null, then I'll say myStatement.close. And then I'll do a similar thing here for my connection. So if my con's not equal to null, then I'll say my con.close. Now, one thing about my con is that it doesn't really close the database connection. All it does is basically puts it back into the connection pool, kind of makes it available for someone else to use. So they're kind of marking it as available now because our connection pool kind of keeps all those connections open, but they simply hand them out to people who really want to use them or whatever. So kind of like when you rent a car or hire a car, you use it and then you return it. And then the company will make it available for someone else to use. So that's the idea here. So don't get too concerned about line 76. They simply make the connection available for someone else to use. All right, but it's really important that you handle this cleanup work, because if you don't, in a production application, you could run into problems if you don't close your result sets or statements. Over time, maybe a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you'll eventually run out of some resources. So make sure you make use of that close technique. All right, so that's pretty much it in our student database util. So we have this method getStudents that's going to return a list of student objects. And we kind of went through the basic process of making this happen. We created an empty list of students, got a connection, SQL, query, and then we processed the result set. And then finally on line 55, we actually return the actual list of students to whoever called it. So that's the most important thing there. So that's it for our student DB util as far as listing students. So this looks really good so far. And our servlet will actually make use of this database util to get data from the database. So good job so far with this work.